you to this installment of Philadelphia Fights Prevention Summit, series of webinars and events. Like Kyle said, my name is Dion Powell. I'm General Counsel and Chief Legal Officer here at Philadelphia Fight, and it is my pleasure today to present to you on the topic of healthcare and human dignity and why law matters. I wanted to reiterate a few points that Kyle just mentioned. We're pleased to offer this course as a CLE pending unit for Pennsylvania. We're offering 1.5 CLE units. We have someone from the CLE board joining us today. I wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page with respect to how we're going to be approved and what some of the things we should consider. There is a question and answer box, as Kyle mentioned. That's going to be our mechanism to ensure interactivity and permits the attendee to interact with the presenters. You should know that the course is being monitored by way of response tracking. So there's a way that the CLE board can evaluate and review the attendance record. Participants are also informed of the minimum and/or recorded system requirements. Obviously, you're here. This is a Zoom meeting, and we are going to provide to you what we believe is high quality written instructional materials. The materials are going to be available via download at the FIGHT website, and we're presenting them to you today. So you have the ability to refer to the materials during the presentation and subsequent to the program. Some objectives. Today, at the conclusion of the webinar, the attendee will be able to identify the individual and structural bases. Let's see, I'm sorry. We're going to be able to have a general understanding of how the courts define human dignity and ways in which the notion is reinforced by way of legal case law and through sound healthcare protocols. And we'll also be able to identify and recognize ways in which principles of human dignity inform the FIGHT healthcare delivery model. A bit of a roadmap. We're going to divide it into 3 parts. There are about 30 slides. The first part is going to focus on what is human dignity and what is the significance under the law. The second part will focus on issues of human dignity in healthcare, and then we'll wrap things up by evaluating Philadelphia Fight and the role of Fqhcs in quality healthcare and promoting human dignity. And then we'll follow it up with the question and answer session that will be led by Kyle and myself. Now, I'm pleased to have with us today Dr. Mario Cruz. He's a colleague and friend of mine. Dr. Cruz is the pediatrics director here at Philadelphia Fight. And also Frank McClellan, another friend, mentor, colleague. I met Frank 16 years ago as a law student in his first year torts course. So I'm happy to have things come full circle to be able to present this with Frank and with Dr. Cruz. And we hope that there will be something that you'll glean from the presentation. By way of background, Healthcare and Human Dignity, Law Matters, is a book that Frank has written and has been published this year. In healthcare and human dignity, individual worth, equality, and autonomy emerge as dominant values at stake in encounters with doctors, nurses, hospitals, and drug companies. Although the public is aware of legal battles over autonomy and dignity in the context of death, the everyday patient's need for dignity has received scant attention. Thus, in Healthcare and Human Dignity, Frank McClellan's collection of cases and individual experiences bring these stories to life and establish beyond doubt that human dignity is of utmost priority in the everyday process of healthcare decision-making. Frank, I just wanted to get started and to ask you, can you give us a little context and to tell us what is that encouraged you to write the book?
Are you able to hear me now? Dion?
I can hear you. There you go.
Okay, great. I hope Kyle hasn't abandoned us. First, let me just thank you for organizing this and Philadelphia Fight and Dr. Cruz. I'm so glad to be a part of the panel with all of you. I think the issues that I'm trying to address in this book are critical to relationships, and I'm trying to clarify what it means when those relationships involve a healthcare professional. And I tried to do it in sort of way of writing stories, Dion, that were a little different than a law book would be set. So let me, in answering your question, why did I write it? I've been concerned about and exploring both personally and professionally, what dignity means in human relationships. So I want to start by reading something to you from the book, which is a part of a personal story involving my father, because in some senses it was my father who made me write this book. He's now deceased, but I'll read this from page 121. At this stage in his life, this was written when my father was about 82, who's now deceased. My father has formed some rather firm opinions about doctors. He does not trust young doctors because they are inexperienced and always in a rush. As I read this, keep in mind, I'm talking about an 82-year-old man who has worked 2 jobs all of his life, migrated from the South, both a small business owner in terms of a barber shop that he owned, and also working in a steel mill, and a deacon in the church. So he has 3 different kinds of environments that I see him in as a child. And he always told me, I'm not reading now, I'm going back to the quote, that one way to judge people's character is to see how do they treat you when they don't know anything about you other than the fact that you are a human being. Do they ignore you? Do they walk by? What do they do? So let me go back to reading. He does not trust white doctors because they do not really care whether Black people live or die. He has many personal experiences as well as stories told to him from the time he was a young boy for those who want to dismiss his distrust based upon skin color as racist. He does not trust foreign doctors because he cannot understand them and they cannot understand him. Indeed, he has been victimized by a foreign doctor who exceeded the scope of consent my father gave for limited surgery. After my father complained about the violation of consent, the doctor asserted, quote, there must have been a misunderstanding, close quote. He does not trust young Black doctors because they too, many of them have forgotten where they came from and only care about making money. The only doctors he really trusts are African-American doctors around his age. Remember, 82. But there are very few of them still practicing. So he does the best he can with the doctors available, but stays on the alert. He's highly suspicious of the motivations of every doctor and skeptical of all their diagnosis and advice, yet he depends on them to keep his now fragile body functioning. Now, that lays out a lot of what I want to talk about today and what I talk about in the book. Because if you want to talk about dignity, you have to first look at how people perceive things and try and see the world through their eyes as opposed to simply looking through your own eyes. And then you have to be, as I write in the last chapter, talk about empathy and compassion. So my father asked me to look at a decision he was about to make with Medicare, enrolling in Medicare and switching possibly to managed care. And he was concerned because, number one, he would end up giving up his doctor, because I told him it was important to make sure that your doctor that you want to see will be among the plan authorized doctors. And he said, well, if I give up my doctor, who am I going to get? And that's why I wrote that paragraph. I said, well, who would you like to look at? He said, I don't trust young Black doctors. I don't trust white doctors. I don't trust foreign doctors. Now, if this is a man who has come through the 40s, has come through Jim Crow, moved like Wilkerson, she almost tells our story of growth, the warmth of other suns, moved from South Carolina to the Pittsburgh industrial area, has fought with union members for recognition, has started his own business, has status in the church as a deacon, and he's very concerned at this stage of the game that he's now in his 80s and he's not able to make the kinds of decisions for himself, and yet he depends upon the medical community. So I started thinking a lot then about how important respect was in relationships, and particularly when you're encountering a healthcare professional who has more knowledge than you do and you have to trust. So that's number one. Let me just lay out number two in terms of the factors that brought me to write this book. And I look back and I was really surprised to see this. I wrote a book called Medical Malpractice, Law, Tactics, and Ethics 25 years ago. And I looked at the preface to the book, and this book is primarily aimed at law students and law faculty and lawyers. Excuse me, my camera just disappeared. In this book, I was focused on being a lawyer because I've led a dual career of being both a law professor and a litigating lawyer. Primarily, I've represented plaintiffs in medical malpractice cases, although I've counseled and spent a lot of time with doctors and healthcare providers at Temple Law Medical School and faculty, that type of thing. So when I look back to the book that I wrote on medical malpractice, law, tactics, and ethics, I dedicated it to a woman who had been a client who had a brain damaged child at the age of 9 months. And here's what I wrote in the preface to that book 20-something years ago. This book seeks to achieve two primary goals. The first one I'm not going to go into now because that deals with medical malpractice cases, mistakes, etc. Here's what I wrote about the second goal. The book's second goal is to highlight human dignity as an issue in medical malpractice law in particular and tort law in general. Concern over money serves as an important motivation for patients to sue and for healthcare providers and their insurers to defend lawsuits. Acknowledging this monetary concern, however, should not keep us from recognizing the significant role that the patient or doctor's sense of worth and dignity plays in medical malpractice litigation. Now listen to this sentence. In a society where the number of people who are old or poor is likely to increase in the next 2 decades, human dignity will often surface as the dominant consideration in medical malpractice litigation. I find that interesting because at this point, I'm really thinking as a practicing lawyer and as a law professor teaching about tactics and ethics, etc. But there was something about my experience of interacting with patients and doctors that made me say, there's more to this than this. It's not simply, everybody makes mistakes. Injuries are caused. And then I thought about this case that I was telling you about where we represented a woman who had a brain damaged baby at 9 months of age, reaction to a local anesthetic. And during the course of that trial, we were Black lawyers, 2 Black lawyers, young out of law school. I started teaching law school out of law school, 2 years out of law school, started litigating about 5 years after that. And my co-counsel was Black. And so we went into Harrisburg, and the case is cited in my book and in the earlier book. And we had to try this case, and on the other side of the room were all white lawyers. There were 6 of them, because we sued a drug company, we sued the hospital, we sued doctors, and we had outstanding expert witnesses. And in picking the jury, we decided to use psychologists to help us because we were concerned about racism. And the trial judge, the federal court judge, was very sensitive to that issue. And he gave us individual voir dire of all these jurors, and we asked them questions, et cetera, about their attitudes toward race, and we finally ended up picking a jury. During the course of the trial, you have to prove damages, meaning what would have this child's life have been like had she not been injured? What kind of job would she have had? What kind of education would she have had? And the defense used an economist to say, look at the work tables of the United States government, and you'll find that Black people have shorter work life expectancy. Black people have less consistent employment patterns. Black people get lower education achievements than others. And I said to myself, this really does offend my dignity. Now, we can talk about civil rights. We can talk about constitutional rights. But when you're talking about a child, and you're saying, and really this is what we asked the jury to think about. Are you saying that 50 years from now, remember this is in the late 70s, are you saying that 50 years from now, this child will suffer the same kind of barriers, the same kind of limitations, the same kind of hierarchical structuring that she's suffering now. And he says, I'm just going by the tables. Well, I'm sad to say that in reality, it's still there. And so the final thing I want to say, Dion, I know I'm running on a bit, but I really
no. By all means, by all means.
This is sort of my life's work. You could almost stand there in the hospital as children are born, and this is what my partner Alan Eaton used to say, who is also now deceased. And you could stand there in the maternity ward and say, here's a winner, here's a loser. Here's a winner, here's a loser. And how would you pick them up? By their race, and to some extent by their gender. Because just as that economist was saying as an expert witness, that white people have greater earning capacity, have greater expectations with respect to education, achievement, have neighborhoods that they're going to live in that contribute to their quality of life and health, you could say, and this child could say, well, how do you know already? And you would say to the child, well, you live in America. And in America, we've had 400 years of hierarchical subordination of people with certain color skin. We've had many years, hundreds, of women being limited. And we haven't even gotten to sexual orientation and other types of individual situations. And so I said to myself, we better begin to look at human dignity and recognize it as such a critical value in the community that independent of other things, money or whatever, we've got to find ways to try and protect it and enhance it. And that's what I'm attempting to do in this book. The medical malpractice book talks about cases, but it doesn't tell the human stories. I wanted to tell the human stories of people in a broader, deeper way. And with respect to the brain damaged child, and I hate to refer to it that way, but that was the key legal component. My daughter, who's now a lawyer, I asked her to go interview the mother because the mother kept the child and raised the child on her own, even though the child could not walk, talk, or eat, and is still living. And I said, I want to find out what her life has been like, what she's been. And I think if I go, she's going to see me as one of the lawyers and she'll talk to me differently than she talks to you. And she went and interviewed her, and she's still taking care of her child. And she said at that point that I consider it a blessing because I have learned how to love and give in a way that very few people have, because this child needs me, I love her, and I want to nourish her. And so I said, to me, that really is the important part. Fortunately, we were able to get a verdict and settlement of a substantial amount of money for her, and she was able to live. But what was most important to me was looking at was her dignity. She had survived her life and raised her child and had a relationship.
Well, Frank, you
One
touched
other
on
thing.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, you go ahead, Dean.
Well, I think that one of the good things that jumped out at me about your book, and one of the things that you've touched on throughout, your narrative this morning, is really the fact that human dignity can present itself as a predominant modicum of value in a lot of different forms of society. Your focus and mine has particularly been in the legal realm. So my question to you is a big picture question, and I'm going to give you a quotation from the introduction to your book. The introduction, Human Dignity as a Lived Experience. To illustrate the importance of protecting human dignity in healthcare and the role that the law can play in encouraging practices and policies to treat human dignity as a predominant value. You said that is what you did when you set out to write this book. My question to you is, how does the law even begin to define something so nebulous as the concept of human dignity?
The answer to that is that it very rarely attempts to wrestle with human dignity as a concept independent of other kinds of values like economic value or religion or affection. It very rarely does, but there are some important instances where the courts have attempted to do that, and the legislatures have done that. So we're going to talk, I hope, later about the how do you pronounce the name of that case?
Obergefell. Obergefell.
Obergefell, okay, involving gay marriage,
Right.
and where the U.S. Supreme Court determined that gay marriage was a constitutional right, and they analyzed it in terms of dignity. So we'll talk more about that later, because they're talking about membership in the community and what it means to have status as equal to other people. So part of what the courts have done is looked at due process in the constitutional sense of sort of fundamental liberty interests. And sometimes it will be in the context of access to facilities, access to schools, etc. If you go back and read Brown versus Board of Education, that's fundamentally based upon, although they're talking about segregation, discrimination in schools, they're really saying at bottom line is, how can you take a group of people and exclude them, give them inferior facilities for education, and consider that to be fundamentally fair, due process or equal protection. So they've wrestled in that area. In the area of tort law, which I have spent a lot of time both teaching and working on, they have wrestled with it and not many times defined human dignity, but they've done it in the context of emotional distress that people have suffered through encounters. And one famous or well-known case in the legal community is Fisher versus Carousel, where a person's in a restaurant and they snatch, the person serving the food snatches the plate back from the African American and says, "We don't serve Black people here." Well, ordinarily torts look for tort cases, which are personal injury for those. I know most of our audience is
I was going to
non-lawyers.
ask you
So
to tell the
torts,
audience, what a tort is. You taught me that. I
yeah,
told you 16 years ago you were my torts professor. So just
yeah.
tell the audience very generally what a tort is.
Okay, so law students take courses the first year, which are grounded primarily in the fundamental areas of human interactions that they need to have some knowledge about. Contracts, property, how do you transfer it, constitutional law, criminal law. And one of the areas is torts. And torts is primarily concerned with how people interact, and when they cause injuries, when are they responsible for paying for those injuries? It could be injuries to the house, injury to the person. My area of focus has always been healthcare. In context of healthcare, I teach generally tort law, I've taught it, but my area of concentration has been how does the system handle healthcare provider produced injuries? And I'm not trying to condemn healthcare providers, because I depend on them and I have a lot of respect for them. But that's what torts is. So in tort law, usually you have to show that you have a physical injury before the courts will recognize your right to proceed and have a trial or court. Well, there's some areas where they have recognized that you ought to have a right even if you don't have a serious physical injury. And usually the focus is on emotional distress. If you've suffered severe emotional distress out of outrageous conduct on the part of the individual. So if I can give you one example that I talk about and develop from the book in tort law, that would be this case called Burdett. And by the way, I hope that we have available, I did extract some and put together, compile a list of recommended reading. Most of them are books, but some of them are cases to make available to the audience. But in this case, a woman came to the hospital ready to deliver her child. And when she got into the emergency room, the nurses called the doctor on call and said, "We've got a woman here who's ready to deliver." The doctor came in, looked at the woman and said, "Who is she?" She was a Latino woman. I don't know if that was the motivation, but it was a part of the facts of the case. And he said, "Has she been here before?" They said, "No." Does she have a doctor? He said, "No." And he said, "Well, take her out of here. I don't want to take care of this woman." And so the nurses said, "Well, you can't do that, because the federal government has passed a statute called the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act, which says that when people come to a hospital that receives federal funds, that we have an obligation to stabilize or examine that patient and then treat them." And the doctor responded, "Well, when the hospital starts paying my medical malpractice insurance bill, they can tell me what to do. Right
Wow.
now, I'm not going to treat her." So he sent her out of the hospital to another hospital in an ambulance with a nurse 100 miles away, fortunately, she had a nurse with her. She delivered her baby, when she got maybe 10, 20 miles out, and they turned around and came back to the hospital. Now, here's a situation, Dion, where traditional tort law would probably have a lot of difficulty because she doesn't have a physical injury. And so the courts had to say, well, is there some way we can give her relief? In that case, they said, well, there was a federal statute, and the federal statute provided for compensation of an injured person when they are presenting to an emergency room and the hospital does not conform to the standards it would ordinarily give to other people in that situation. So again, I think that's dignity. Finally, I really want to urge people to go back and read, if you have never done it, the Dred Scott decision. Because I think the Dred Scott decision in constitutional law explains so much about what's going on now in America, because in that case, the US Supreme Court in the late 1800s is considering whether or not a Black person who's gone to a free state can stay there and enjoy the benefit of freedom in that state. And the court holds no, that this is property. And being property, one state doesn't have the right to confer the freedom and liberty on this person. And that bond of slavery travels with them. But not only that, they wrote almost 100-page opinion. It's the Dred Scott decision. Sometimes you get it in political science, etc. And in that decision, they're explaining why it is that the white world, the Western world, has no respect and regard for Black people.
Wow.
And they spend page after page describing why in the eyes and culture of Black people. And you would think that that was history, but we all know when we look at the knee on the neck, that's not history. It is a part of history, but it's also a part of the present. So
Right.
this gives me a chance to really read what I want to read most and recommend reading for everyone. This is beyond law, but it's the foundation.
One of the things that jumped out about me was on page 26 when you referred to Professor Leslie Meltzer Henry's 5 concepts of dignity. And you touched on that a bit in your commentary, particularly with respect to equality. Professor Henry broke it down in five different categories. She said that after reviewing all the body of Supreme Court work, that she could put the court's view of dignity into 5 separate and distinct categorical constructs. One of them would be equality, the other would be institutional status, the third would be liberty, the fourth is personal integrity, and the fifth is a sense of collective virtue. When you talk about the Dred Scott case, clearly, that implicates values of liberty and equality and how dignity permeates the law in those facets. But we all know that it's June, and this is LGBT Pride Month. You mentioned the Obergefell case. I think it's appropriate right now to move to that and to tell the audience the significance of that case with respect to human dignity, and for you to give us your insights on what the court said in 2015. If I'm correct, I think it was Justice Kennedy who wrote for the majority court in this case, and it created a real groundswell of support for the LGBT cause, particularly in the construct of marriage. There's a paragraph here that's on the screen that I think is important for us to read in whole, because it really puts the notion of human dignity in an outright context. The Obergefell court wrote, "No union is more profound than marriage, for it embodies the highest ideals of love, fidelity, devotion, sacrifice, and family. In forming a marital union, 2 people become something greater than they once were. As some of the petitioners in the cases demonstrate, marriage embodies a love that may endure even past death. It would misunderstand these men and women to say they disrespect the idea of marriage. Their plea is that they do respect it so deeply that they seek to find its fulfillment for themselves. Their hope is not to be condemned to live in loneliness, excluded from one of the civilization's oldest institutions. They ask for equal dignity in the eyes of the law. The Constitution grants them that right." Now, this case, I think, is particularly outstanding in the moment, again, because it's June, but because the court specifically uses the term equal dignity. And I think that in looking at the case law through the lens of Professor Henry that would be important to note. What can you tell me about the Obergefell case and their use of human dignity and how they defined it?
Well, you've done a wonderful job, and I think that quote there is really an important quote. And hopefully, remember that that case was decided by 5-4 with Justice Kennedy writing for the majority, and it could have gone the other way. And I hate to be a doomsday kind of prognosticator, but you know, with the way in which the court has shifted, it's and have selected in terms of the last this administration. And during the Obama administration, we didn't get many federal judges. So we're going to have a generation of people who are facing a court with very conservative values, and they're going to have to fight, and we're going to have to fight to preserve something, that view of dignity and liberty that was expressed by Justice Kennedy. But it's the fundamental notion of there's certain minimal and core values in any community that each person who's a human being ought to have access to. And I started thinking about this and studying it a long time ago. I did an LLM at Yale University after I had graduated from law school, in which I started studying healthcare law and other things. And I talk about these professors who had such influence over me during that period of time in the book. It was Laswell and McDougall. One was a political science and one was a lawyer in the law school. They both in the law school. But they said, here's what dignity is from their perspective. It's having access to a minimum amount of values that are critical to human recognition in the community. So you can say, okay, what kind of values are we talking about? We're talking about affection, and that's what that case was about. Who do you express your love to, your expression, and how do you get it recognized by the community? So if somebody says to you, you can love anybody you want to, but as they went through a period of time saying, just don't tell us, don't bring pictures in, don't have Valentine's Day, etc. You're limiting that person's liberty and that person's access to a core value, because we all need affection. There's a certain amount of income, there's a certain amount of wealth we need, there's a certain amount of shelter that we need, there's a certain amount of religion, affection. If you're not religious formally, you can do it informally in terms of your belief. But anyhow, the moment you start interfering with those kind of core values and say, you can have it, but you can't. So there's really, I think there's two aspects of dignity that are important for us to work on, and both in terms of potential legislation as well as the way we treat each other. One is what I talked about in the beginning when I was talking about my father. How do people treat you when they don't know who you are? They simply know you're a human being. You're there to deliver your baby. You've never seen them before. How do people treat you when you show up at the party and you are with a same-sex person, or you're with a person of a different race? That's part of who you are and the dignity. And then there's the equality aspect of it. That is, are you being treated in the same way as other human beings? Now, the book that I recommend everybody read, and I do it at least once a year, and particularly the prologue, is The Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, a novel, which I think everybody should be reading when they before they get out of high school. Because I think he does the best job I've ever seen of defining dignity in the prologue. I'd like to read just the beginning paragraph or the beginning part of what he taught. This is a situation where the protagonist in the novel is a young man who's been subjected to certain kinds of betrayals throughout his lifetime. And here's what he says, and he's describing in the prologue how finally one day he snapped. And somebody bumped into him on the street, a white person, and he's black, and they didn't apologize, and he couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed them and started butting them on the head, and he said, oh yeah, I butted him. But here's the first paragraph. I am an invisible man. No, I'm not a spook like those who haunted Edgar Allan Poe, nor am I one of your Hollywood movie ectoplasms. I am a man of substance, of flesh and bone, fiber and liquid, and I might even be said to possess a mind. I'm invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me. Like the bodiless heads you see sometimes in circus shows, it is as though I have been surrounded by mirrors of hard, distorting glass. When they approach me, they see only my surroundings, themselves or figments of their imagination. Indeed, everything and anything except me. Now, Dion, just think about it. Does this describe what we're going through now with the crisis? And it's police who didn't see the person in front of them. They saw something, and it wasn't that person.
Right.
It's a hospital or a doctor, or it is, as importantly, a voter or a legislator. You know, you have these people who say, I'm not going to support universal access to healthcare in America. I'm going to devote my energy and resources to repealing Obamacare.
Wow. Right.
And I'm saying to myself, don't you realize that people will suffer? Don't you realize that people are in pain? And what does it do to their sense and value of being a human being and a member of the community? It's like you're not seen. They're the invisible people.
I think now is a good time to invite Dr. Mario Cruz to the table and to get Dr. Cruz to talk about some of the issues and to apply them to a healthcare perspective from a practitioner standpoint. Professor McClellan, you write on page 84 that healthcare offers an environment that is ripe for violations of human dignity. There's a vast imbalance of power between the healthcare professional and the patient. You know, you just touched on that in your story about, you know, just the familiarity of a nurse or a doctor or a friendly face and what that can mean to a patient that historically has been disadvantaged and hadn't had as much of an opportunity to participate in the system. And in today's cultural landscape, we've seen that the balance of power is being challenged. You know, if it's not on the streets right now, if it's not from in Black Lives Matter, you know, it's really manifesting itself throughout just about every facet of society. In the context of healthcare, Dr. Cruz, I wanted to punt this one to you and to ask you, you know, how do you propose that medical professionals confront those challenges? How do we confront those vast imbalances of power that Professor McClellan mentions, and how do you do it in your daily practice?
Thank you, Dion. Can you all see me and hear me?
We can. Thank you.
All right. Is it okay if I share a couple of slides? I have some really nice pictures I wanted to.
Of course, Dr. Cruz. He's known for his PowerPoint skills, so we'd be happy to see it.
So I just wanted to. That's a great question, Dion, and I got to start by saying that I learned more. Oddly, I learned more about human dignity in my 1 year in private practice than I did in my 12 years working in the inner city. And I say that because in the first 12 years of working in the inner city at a large academic institution, I thought I was doing great work. I thought I was treating patients the way they deserve to be treated. And it wasn't until I went to a white private practice that took only insured patients that I saw how you treat patients with dignity. You know, you don't make them wait 3 hours to see you. When they call, you pick up the phone. If you miss their call, you call them back. It was as if it was a level of care that I didn't even know that existed. I thought the healthcare system was the healthcare system, and that's how it was. When I saw how these patients were treated, I immediately thought, wow, let me see if I can bring that to the inner city. And so
let's put that into context, Dr. Cruz. Can you tell the audience a little bit about your background and what has really informed your approach to healthcare from a personal standpoint?
Yeah, so personally, I grew up in the South Bronx. I grew up in the Mount Haven area of the Bronx in the middle of a crack epidemic. I grew up going to health centers. I remember waiting for hours as a child to see the doctor and thinking, even as a kid, I bet white kids are not waiting as long as I am. I sort of had that at a young age. And so I carried that with me through my whole life. I worked at St. Christopher's, a large academic institution nearby, excellent medical care, but the system, like a lot of places, just was not very patient-centered. And so Philadelphia Fight gave me what I call a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to build a clinic from scratch, literally from scratch, And if you all think about this as the audience, if you had the chance to build a clinic from scratch, knowing what you know about human dignity, what would you do? What would this space look like? What policies would you implement? What protocols would you follow? And so that was my challenge. And so a couple of things that we did in our clinic, thinking about micro level ways to show human dignity. We designed our clinic from scratch with the mind of a parent who comes in with 2 children. And we followed them through every single step along the way. We followed them through making a phone call for the appointment. We followed them through the waiting room. We followed them in the exam rooms. And what we systematically tried to do is we try to demonstrate 3 things. We want to respect your time, respect your money, and respect your life experiences. Those were the 3 main principles that we designed our clinic of. I put this slide up here just to give you a sense for those who are not medical professionals. It takes about 45 unique steps need to happen in order for a routine well-child exam to take place. 45 steps. But there's actually only 5 of those that matter to the patient, right? You want to see your professional and get an opinion. You want to get your forms filled out. You want to get your blood work. You want to get your shots, and you want to get some lab results. Everything else is waste. And so what we decided to do is implement what's called efficient compassion. So we really are experts in process improvement, and we try to eliminate as many of these steps as possible. As an example, we spent 200 hours this past year trying to solve a problem that would cut patient wait time by half an hour. So 200 hours to cut half an hour for every single patient for the year. And that doesn't seem like a lot. Maybe, you know, from the context of dignity, it's like, how does that make a difference? Well, half an hour is the difference between a parent getting home on time to pick up their kid. You know, half an hour means that the patient, the parent may not have to skip work. And so that's income. And so, you know, we spent 200 hours doing this paperless process in order to make life easier for the patients. Just another small sort of micro thing that we do at our practice. Here's our waiting room. It's beautiful. It's nice and bright. What I'm most proud about our spaces is that you don't find the word no anywhere. And when you think about patients and people who are hearing no all day, every day, in big ways and small, to go to a place that's always clean, always neat, and doesn't say no for anything, doesn't say, you know, no cell phones, no snacks, no talking, no this, no that. That doesn't exist in our space. The other thing that we sort of tried to do at our practice, specifically to show people that they are important, is we became top docs. And that seems kind of silly, but when you go to private practices, you go to a white private practice where everyone is insured, you see top doc everywhere. You're reminded over and over and over that you deserve the best. And so I thought it was critical for us to remind our patients that they deserve the best too. And so what we did, there's a formula for all of these awards, I'm sure you know. So we figured out the formula for how to become a top doc in this magazine, and we cracked the code. And so now we're all top docs, you know? And, you know, we're gonna plaster this all over our walls so that people are reminded that you deserve the best. Not only do you deserve the best, but you are getting the best here.
Well, congratulations, Dr. Cruz, on that accomplishment. And one of the things that jumps out at me is that you view that accomplishment to the degree that it impacts your patients. You know, to some doctors, it is to them a personal accolade to be recognized by the Philadelphia Magazine, but for you to be able to reconfigure that aesthetic and to place the priority in terms of what that means for your patients, I think speaks a lot to your practice and to what you've been able to do here for us at Philadelphia Fight.
Yeah, no, it's all about the patient, and that mentality has to come from the top down. The last thing I wanted to highlight, because you mentioned some LGBT legal issues. I think one of the critical parts of human dignity is recognizing what you don't know, you know, and learning to listen to your patients. And I wanted to share this fun story with you. So on the left, these are, you know, we're pediatricians, so our goal is to support families and support, particularly nursing, because that's the best way to feed a baby. On the left, this is a sign that we created so that parents can nurse in the exam rooms without being interrupted. And a couple of months into opening, we asked some parents, we said, hey, what do you think about our signs? And I look at this, same-sex female couple, and they start giggling. And I said, what's the matter? And they said, this doesn't look like us. And we said, oh, okay. So we listened to our patients, and we currently have like 9 different versions of our nursing signs, but these are some other follow-up signs that came out and were better received after the original.
Thank you, Dr. Cruz. Can you comment just very, very briefly on your patient population, and what are some of the challenges that you see in your patients based on those factors that they have no control over?
Yeah, so we are, for those who don't know, Philadelphia Fight is an FQHC. It's a federally qualified health center. We are essentially a safety net clinic. We are a clinic that is required by law to see any patient, no matter who they are, where they're from, what language they speak, what insurance they have, or how much money they have. It's a beautiful system, and it allows us a lot of freedom. Our patients, it's the most diverse group of patients I've ever had in my career. I love it. We are seeing, we have recently, I think last year, 20% of our patients were new asylum seekers, mostly from Central America. We see patients who live in downtown Philadelphia who have private insurance. We see patients who have, most of our patients have Medicaid insurance. Probably 60% of our patients are African American. It's a wide swath of patients. We have a growing number of same-sex parents who are coming in. We have a growing number of children who are gender non-binary. And so it's a really diverse group.
Right. Can I have the screen back, Dr. Cruz?
Of course. Always, Dion.
I appreciate that. Thank you for your take on those issues. And I want you to stick around because we're going to talk a little more about FQHCs and what that actually means. And I would like for you to share some of your thoughts as we move forward as far as that goes as well. All right. So just to orient the audience and make sure you're all still with me, I promised in part 1 we would talk about human dignity and what that meant in the context of the law. We had a very robust conversation with Professor Frank McClellan, who shared his thoughts with us. And then we moved on to the healthcare piece now with Dr. Cruz and him talking to us about what he was able to do in building and establishing his pediatrics clinic here at Philadelphia Fight. And I wanted to now pivot a bit to healthcare disparities by race. Dr. Cruz, I wanted you to stay close by because we're going to get to this point on healthcare disparities, particularly within the context of race and how people of color, African Americans, and Black people are disproportionately impacted. Can you give us 2 seconds of just your take on some of those inequities, and then we'll move on and let Professor McClellan talk about Derek Bell and his final analysis about racism through the lens of healthcare.
Sure. Very quickly, I'll just say that a lot of these disparities are probably created by very small, obviously there's bigger systemic issues, but process. So for example, if you have a clinic that is majority Black where there's not enough staff to pick up the phone, and you have another clinic that's majority white and you have it well staffed and you have enough people to pick up the phone, what's going to happen over time is that the one population is going to learn that they don't have as much access as the other population. And so that group is more likely to use the ER. That's one very, very small example. When you are sick at nighttime and you call and you need help from the triage nurse, if one group of patients has access to triage nurses and the other group does not, over time that is going to exacerbate any inequity that already exists.
And do you see that inequity particularly around race? Is it the conclusion that people of color experience those wait times and those lack of resources to a degree that their counterparts don't?
I think wait time in person, wait time on the phone, lack of getting phone calls back, all of those things, I do think there's very clear disparities based on race.
Right. Professor McClellan, I want you to comment because you take a lot of time in your book, particularly an entire section, and you discuss racism and the impact that racial injustice has had on the healthcare system. And I found it particularly interesting that you start chapter 7 now with a discussion of Professor Derek Bell's take on race in America. Uh, in lectures, articles, and books that were published in the 1990s, it was my understanding that Professor Bell basically confessed that he realized that he and others had pursued these legal strategies for decades that were destined to fail because they were based on a false premise. And that false premise would be that American racism was an aberration or something that could not continue to exist in a modern democracy, and that we had to embrace equality as a predominant value. Professor Bell came to the conclusion that that was a false premise. And one of his famous quotes is very succinct and, in a sense, um, I guess, forthright in terms of how he felt about racism. And he said, racism in America is permanent. Professor McClellan, do you share Derek Bell's view of racism and the fact that it's permanent in America?
Yes, I do. And it's a hard thing to accept. But I do think that it's critical to have both a paradigm and a focus when you're trying to solve real social problems. So that in the 60s, in the 70s, Thurgood Marshall led a group. I clerked for a judge here, Bill Hasty, who was the first Black in federal court judge in the United States. And during that period of time, all of them would pass on to the next generation. At that point, I was part of the next generation. This belief that it's so clear morally that we're on the right side of this issue of desegregation, of equal opportunity, etc. And that the vast majority of people in this country, and they would say in the world, will eventually change. And they will embrace this notion of equal justice, equal human beings, etc. And so when you do that, then you say, then what we have to do is appeal to that group of people and let them become the majority. And I don't think we give that up. I mean, we still want the majority. We're not saying, by that statement, I don't think Derek Bell is saying every person in America is racist, although we've now learned a lot about unconscious bias. If you take the Harvard implicit test in terms of bias, you'll find that we all have biases being raised in society. But the idea is that it's so pervasive. It really is apt to describe it as both an epidemic and a virus, because through movies, through books, through culture, the minds and hearts of people are affected, and it gets carried from generation to generation. You keep asking yourself, when you see somebody who is 20-something years old, in Philadelphia, there was outside of Philadelphia, was a march in terms of protest, and then there's a white man standing there with his fist up, and I think it may have been Delaware, with his knee on someone's neck, holding his hand up in triumph to taunt the protesters. So the first thing is,
I'm sorry, Frank, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was going to comment on some of the nightmarish images that we're seeing, today, and with respect to race. And one of those stories that comes to mind from your book is the story of Miss Shirley Johnson. And when you talk about weaving personal narratives and stories of real life, real human, experiences through your book, and then to apply a legal context to it, that story stuck out to me. And I wanted you to take maybe 2 or 3 minutes just to tell the audience who Shirley Johnson was and the impact that you were able to have on Miss Johnson's life. And then I'm going to ask Dr. Cruz to join us again to talk about the way that he addresses some of the Shirley Johnsons of the world in his practice.
Okay, so as I move into the story, I think it's appropriate to say, when you're talking about racism being permanent, you're talking about different forms of manifesting that racism and that hierarchical subordination. One is what we were talking about earlier of sort of conscious. What are people willing to say consciously? This is what I think, this is what I believe. The other one is unconscious racism. And the third one, which we're really dealing with now, and they oftentimes merge together, is structural racism, that the system is built to, like when I talked about you win and you lose when you're born, that's not saying that you will necessarily be limited, although you probably will, by conscious racism. But if that doesn't get you, the structure will. So Derek Bell's statement that it's permanent, I think is important, because if you say, you're not saying, I want to really emphasize this, that because it's permanent, we give up. What you're saying is that we have to be prepared for a lifetime of fighting. It's not going to go away when you get a certain age, and therefore you have to fight. So Ms. Johnson is a 30-something-year-old woman, goes into the hospital having problems, needing gynecological care. She gets a surgery done on her, which she does not know is really novel and being done by a person who has very limited experience. And after the surgery, she has all kinds of serious physical problems, including defecating through the vagina and other kinds of problems. And she asked the doctor, who's a white doctor, well, what's going on here? What's going on with my body? How is this? And he says to her, and I sort of titled the chapter that way, Black people don't understand. And so all of a sudden, she's lying there and she's saying, this is what he has to say to me to explain what's happened to my. Now, she came to my office. We sat down, we talked, we interviewed as a lawyer, because that's what happens when people feel indignant that way, and hurt. And she said, I'm never going to another doctor in my life. And no one's ever going to touch me down there again, because I will never trust them again. Now, you want to talk about what produces disparities. Fortunately, after a period of time, we were able to persuade her to go to a different doctor and follow up, and she was treated properly. But we don't know what was on this doctor's mind when he suddenly blurted out. Maybe it was defensiveness, maybe it was something else. But the reality is, and there, what I'd like to do at this point, Dion, I would like to at least offer some positive notions in terms of this, of dealing with permanent racism, because I really was impressed with Dr. Cruz's description of the way in which Philadelphia Fight has approached this problem. And as you know, I was on the board of Philadelphia Fight for probably a decade, and that's what sort of drew me to this notion of empowering consumers and patient respect. So there are a number of organizations who are not understanding the permanence of racism that I've worked with. And I'm just going to name a few, because I think we ought to talk about people who are willing to sacrifice money and other kinds of possible self-advancements for decades. There's an organization here in Philadelphia called To Our Children's Future with Health. And what they do, and Robin Foster Drain is a doctor for over 20 years, has built an organization that helps poor people, Black people, and people in Philadelphia with coalitions to get physical exams, the children, to get physical exams and vaccination. Now that's one way that you respond to health disparities, not looking for headlines, simply saying, where's the need and how do we do it, notwithstanding the racism. There's an organization called Movement is Life, which is a national organization that's dealing with orthopedic health disparities, studying, researching it, trying to come up with strategies. Because if you think about it, Dion, if you hurt your knee, or if you're unable to move around, all of a sudden you're a different person, right? And people treat you differently, your sense of respect, etc. And then we shouldn't forget about the good lawyers. People always talk about negative. I've been on the board of the AIDS Law Project. This is the one organization in the country that devotes itself to trying to help people who are patients and victims of HIV/AIDS and the kind of societal struggles that they confront that are different and they need help with. So as you know, I dealt with Chapter 2. I spent a lot of time talking about HIV and AIDS because I thought a lot about people who had suffered and the kind of indignities that they experienced as they go through. So yes, I believe that racism is permanent. If we can probably persuade more and more people. And the other encouraging thing is if you look out the streets now in terms of the protests, there are so many people of different ethnic backgrounds, and white and Latina and Asian, who are all out there marching. And so another book I want to recommend I'm sorry, I'm in my professor bag right now.
No, we appreciate it.
We have to read about Vincent Harding, who was part of the Brain Trust and the Heart Trust with Martin Luther King. And Vincent Harding, here's what he wrote in a book called Hope and History many years ago. He says, the conventional term, quote, civil rights movement, close quote, is too narrow a description for the great Black-led eruption that shook the anti-democratic white supremacist foundations of this nation long ago. Indeed, when we look back from the vantage point of Beijing and Prague, from Berlin and Soweto, we realize that post-World War II African Americans' freedom movement was our own seminal contribution to the massive pro-democracy struggles that have set the globe spinning in these times. And it sounded like he was describing what's happening today. It looked as if we had made this tremendous progress. And I'm talking about this because healthcare takes place within the context of the nation and the environment in which it's delivered. We thought we had made so much progress with President Obama. And we went down to Washington, D.C. for my wife and I, and we were having lunch with some white folks we just met there because the human spirit was following us around. And we said, we want to be closer to people. We wanted to expand our notions and horizons. And so we had 8 years of that, and then we're pushed back again. But the reality is, and Derek Bell, who talked about racism and permanent, I asked him one time because, we would meet at some of these law professors' conventions, how can you be so negative and skeptical? He said, I'm not. I'm just telling you to deal with the structure. And then he wrote a book, or he had written a book called Gospel Choirs. And what he talked about in that book of Gospel Choirs was how Black people in the most horrendous circumstances were able to keep themselves going, get up every morning and go to work and go to school, notwithstanding all the odds.
Resilience. A sense of resilience.
Resilience, that's the right word to use, right. Resilience.
Right. Well, I think that, that you have touched on basically everything that I could have imagined that we would have today in a presentation like this, and the transition to Philadelphia Fight and to your work with Fight. I couldn't have done that better myself. I wanted to share with the audience in the last 15 minutes or so a little bit about Philadelphia Fight, what exactly we are, and how they can make a substantial impact in our patients' lives after they leave this seminar. So very, very quickly, and thanks, Professor McClellan, for the shout out to Philadelphia Fight. On page 11, I see that you reference us and your time on the board of directors, together with the work that you did with the AIDS Law Project. But Philadelphia Fight, for those in the audience who are not familiar with our organization, started in 1990 as an AIDS clinical research organization. A little fact I like to share with folks is that FIGHT stands for Field Initiated Grant for HIV Trials. It was founded as a site of the American Foundation for AIDS Research, which we all know as AMFAR. And I have a little parenthetical note here that we should thank Madonna, because one of the pieces of legend that follow Philadelphia Fight is that a lot of the funding that got us off the ground was due to Madonna's contribution of all of the proceeds to one of her legs of a concert tour. If it wasn't for Madonna, then AMFAR wouldn't have been able to raise as much money as they were able to during that time, and Philadelphia Fight is a direct recipient of some of that money. So if nothing else, you can leave today knowing that Madonna was significant in Philadelphia Fight's formation. We developed a citywide network of HIV and AIDS providers to do clinical research in underserved communities. When you read about some of the early days of Philadelphia Fight, you'll see that a lot of the stories and a lot of the news articles focus on the fact that in the early 1990s, HIV was still seen as a gay white man's disease. There was very little research and very little emphasis on minorities, people of color, mothers, expecting mothers, children. A lot of those populations were excluded from research studies. So Philadelphia Fight started that citywide network of providers, and the goal was to do clinical research. And as our CEO, Jane Scholl, would tell you, that over time, we added these clinical services, social services, and education programs because patients liked coming here. Folks appreciated the work that we did. They understood the sense of dignity that we brought to the work and to the work that we were doing. And they really appreciated it so much that from 1997 to 2013, the LAC Center, which is our infectious disease practice, it grew to be the largest HIV practice in Philadelphia. There were just under 2,000 patients at the time, and it was generally recognized as among the best in the area. We're proud to say that all the physicians here are ID trained, um, meaning they're infectious disease trained, and they're all affiliated with Penn Medicine, whether that's University of Pennsylvania Hospital, Presbyterian, or HUP. FIGHT developed interest in other areas as well. Project Teach, again, Professor McCullen gave us a shout out on pages 112 and 113. That is a program that teaches folks who are HIV positive life skills, and then they go through a series of week-long courses, and they graduate, and they go out and they train other folks in the community. Our Institute of Community Justice is another program that Philadelphia FIGHT has that's centered on newly returning citizens, injustice and incarceration, and how we can impact the lives of those folks, primarily through our work with Hep-C and the Hep-C program that we have that's led by Dr. Stacy Truskin, our new medical director, should I say. The AIDS Library is also housed at Philadelphia FIGHT through our Critical Path Learning Center. And in general, over time, we became more concerned with conditions that led people to acquire HIV rather than folks who, rather than addressing the symptoms of the disease itself. So there are risk factors like criminal justice, general inaccessibility of healthcare, and the corporate takeover of American medicine. I borrowed this slide from our CEO, and I can tell that that's something that she added there. She talks a lot about the difficulties presented when you have to address financial disparities under, I guess, corporate control. And of course, the issues of poverty. This next slide really just focuses on the intersection of healthcare, poverty, and civil rights, because it leads to really the focus of Philadelphia FIGHT and what we are. You know, I just told you a little bit about who we are. People know us for our work in the AIDS and the HIV world. People know us for the culturally competent approach that we bring to healthcare. People know us for these soft characteristics that have really come to define the organization. But one of the things that's very important is that 2014, in the trajectory of Philadelphia's lifespan, was very pivotal for the organization because it became a federally qualified health center. We moved from the construct of an AIDS services organization to being what's called an Fqhc. There's a slide here, since I wanted to speak to lawyers throughout the presentation, but particularly with respect to some of the statutes that govern the formation of Philadelphia FIGHT, kind of what the bones are. Empathy and human dignity, I would say that, of course, that's in the soul of the organization, but it also reflects itself in the bones of who we are because of Fqhcs and what that designation really means. The term Federally Qualified Health Center is derived from the Social Security Administration Act. And it basically says that we receive funding under Section 330 of the Public Health Services Act. If you're able to receive funding under Section 330, then technically you are a federally qualified health center. Yeah, I also think that it's important for, I guess, the public health folks in the audience, because this is an interdisciplinary audience. We're happy to have lawyers, doctors, social workers, and also folks from the public health world. H. Jack Geiger might be somebody who stands out to you folks as the father of the community health centers movement. Philadelphia FIGHT, I mentioned us being a federally qualified health center, but that term is also more recognized as community health center or neighborhood health center. And at this part of the presentation, I think it's important to recognize Jack Geiger and what his contributions were to this whole movement, and the notion that inequity, poverty, healthcare, and racial disadvantage were somehow related. So Geiger was born in 1926. He was a physician, civil rights activist, and he studied in South Africa at the time. I think the city's name was Filola. And when he was in Filola, he witnessed a unique community-based healthcare model. And he saw the impact that it had in the South African community and wanted to bring the model to the United States. We'll talk about what some of the defining characteristics are, but in terms of, there we go. A little bit more about Jack Geiger is that again, he was bringing healthcare through a racial lens, having founded Physicians for Human Rights. He was a founder of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, the Medical Committee for Human Rights, a consultant to SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He was the director of the very first rural and urban community health centers in the United States, one of which was in Boston, and the other is down in the Mississippi Delta, and it still survives today. Jack was one of the first folks, or actually the first, to receive funding from the Office of Economic Opportunity. He received $1.2 million in a grant that he used to help open those two clinics, again, in 1965 and in 1966. What Jack was doing, what Jack was doing was he was capitalizing off of Lyndon B. Johnson's War on Poverty that really defined the 1960s. For any history buffs in the room, you recognize that time as being one of significant unrest or upheaval in the United States around civil rights, racial equity, just social injustice issues altogether. And in 1964, the Office of Economic Opportunity established neighborhood health centers as part of Lyndon B. Johnson's War on Poverty. And that was because, Jack Geiger had requested the $1.2 million grant and really came to define what this system would look like. And really it was all geared towards providing comprehensive health care, being accessible to low-income recipients, and being responsive to patient needs. I came across an excerpt from a Jack Geiger exhibit. If you're interested in this guy, you should Google him, and one of the first headings will be from UNC Chapel Hill's library, and it gives you a bunch of resources from an archive. And here is a 1 minute and 21-second clip about Jack Geiger.
Movement's voter registration drive. Dr. Jack Geiger left Boston, where he was in medical school, and traveled south.
15 or 20 of us across the country spontaneously formed an organization called the Medical Committee for Human Rights, sending hundreds of physicians, nurses, social workers, psychologists, and others that summer to Mississippi to provide medical care, not just for the white kids coming down from the north, but for all of the indigenous civil rights workers in Mississippi. And I served as the field coordinator for that effort. And in the course of that, took a long look around at what I saw in Mississippi and realized that I didn't have to go to Africa or Latin America or Southeast Asia to do what I wanted to do, that we had all of that here, not at the same absolute level, but certainly at the same relative level to the rest of the population. The southern rural areas, the urban ghettos of the north, Appalachia, the Native American reservations, one could count the populations that lacked medical care, that lived in poverty, that had huge burdens of illness and premature mortality, and limited or no access to medical care. I kept coming back with my colleagues from Boston to Mississippi that fall. And there was a meeting in Greenville, Mississippi on December 11, 1964, to discuss what do we do now. And for the first time, I don't know why I had blocked it all, I remembered Palella.
Geiger went on to secure funding from the federal government to establish 2 successful community health centers in Boston and Mississippi. They were based on the model established by the Fqhcs in South Africa, and you can see them featured in the display to your left.
So that was taken from an exhibit that was traveling throughout the United States about healthcare disparity and issues, and Jack Geiger was prominently featured. I'll leave you with one more fact about Jack, which I found very interesting, was this kid, when he was 14 years old in 1940, he ran away from home and found himself in Harlem, in the middle of the Harlem Renaissance, or at the end of the Harlem Renaissance. And he was very fascinated by Black culture, by Black art, and he found himself backstage at Native Son. And Canada Lee is a very prominent African-American actor, and he was playing the title role in Native Son. And he had a chance, or Jack Geiger had a chance to meet Canada Lee. Canada Lee leaves the theater, goes to Harlem, and ends up on Canada Lee's doorstep. He goes on his doorstep and says, that he needs somewhere to stay. Canada Lee was married, reached out to his wife, and they agreed to take Jack Geiger in. And Jack spent years under the tutelage of Canada Lee. And he looked at Canada Lee as sort of a father figure and a mentor. And I think that that very much informed his approach to his career down the line. So if you're interested in Jack Geiger, very interesting guy. But again, he's the father of community health centers, the father of this notion that if you combine community-based resources with quality healthcare, that you would see outcomes. So that's what FQHCs are, and that's what Philadelphia Fight is, community-based. 51% of our board has to be a health center patient. We operate on a sliding fee scale. Basically, we can turn no one away because of their inability to pay. All of our healthcare services are provided free of charge or on a sliding fee scale. I shouldn't say free of charge. They're on a sliding fee scale, but no one is turned away for an inability to be able to pay. We also are held accountable. There are patient satisfaction surveys, which I think is a real manifestation of human dignity and what Philadelphia Fight thinks about the patients, and in turn, what the patients think about us. You know, we use a lot of those metrics to govern processes and procedures and refine things as we go. Quality assurance is also important in the FQHC world. We're beholden to federal government statutes and federal government oversight with regards to quality assurance and making sure that folks stay safe and stay healthy and that we don't have any claims. So the impact of the FQHCs is really substantial. You know, more than 28 million folks a year rely upon healthcare services from places like ours. That's 1 in 12 people, that's 1 in 9 children, 1 in 5 rural residents, 1 in 3 living in poverty. You know, the numbers are here and represented for you graphically, but the impact that FQHCs have in the healthcare space is undeniable. And I wanted to pivot back to Dr. Cruz to just have him kind of take us home and to share with us a few thoughts on what it's like working at an FQHC and how some of his policies and procedures are really governed by the theme of this presentation, which is human dignity.
So I love working for an FQHC.
Okay, there you go.
Can you hear me?
We've got about 5 minutes before we take questions and answers. So I'll give you about two minutes, Mario. Do you have any last thoughts or any takeaways or anything that you know, anything you wanted to say?
You're so generous with the time, Dion.
Hey, you know, I've got to try to manage time and also keep us moving. So.
No, I mean, it's wonderful to work for an FQHC. It's the first time in my career that I truly get to take care of anyone, no matter where they're from. In previous jobs, I would be unable to take care of a new immigrant who just came from Guatemala, who's escaping violence and has no insurance and not a penny to their name. You know, those are patients who in my previous practices would be turned away because they couldn't pay. And so it's a wonderful opportunity personally. It fulfills a personal mission. So that's what I have to say about my experience working for an FQHC. It gives you a lot more freedom, you know, because I know that I'm not turning anyone away. It allows me to operate the practice much more efficiently. I'll give you one tiny example. A patient walks in, they don't, you know, in a lot of practices, the front desk is used almost as a barrier to ensure payment before the patient passes through. At my clinic, I don't need that barrier because we are going to see them no matter what. So they come in, they go straight to an exam room, and we get started. We can register them in the exam room, we can get them home a lot quicker. So it's a much more efficient system.
Professor McClellan, thank you, Dr. Cruz. Professor McClellan, I wanted to show you that I did include the list of recommended cases and also the list of recommended books. I would point out your publications here, as well as the Derek Bell discussion that we had, and also the Dred Scott case. And you know, we really tried to take a bird's eye view at this issue and touched on a lot of things. Do we have any questions in the audience that we should get to, Kyle, that we can maybe take 2 questions before we move on?
Absolutely. There are a few questions. And before we proceed, I just wanted to Thank you, Professor McClellan, for really challenging us by providing us stories and context. And Dion, I wanted to thank you for providing history and context to this presentation. And Dr. Cruz, I wanted to personally thank you for providing a firsthand experience and perspective as what a practical application of human dignity looks like in an Fqhc. So thank you. We do have a few questions. The first question asks, as we take a deeper look at systemic racism as it relates to healthcare for Black people, how do we make sure they receive the healthcare they desire as a human, regardless of their income or race?
I can answer that one and tell you to go to www.fight.org. Philadelphia Fight is the organization that we talked about, which goes way far and beyond in providing healthcare to folks regardless of where you come from. So if you want a hardcore, concrete answer, I would refer you to Philadelphia Fight and to providers like Dr. Cruz, who's one of 5 top docs here at Philadelphia Fight. So that would be a practical answer to the question. Maybe Professor McClellan could take maybe 30 seconds or 1 minute to talk about what that would look like from a bigger picture.
Yeah, I would just add that there's another good book that I would recommend by Dr. Augustus White. Is called, quote, Seeing Patients, close quote. That's the title of it. And he does a wonderful job in that book in talking about what the medical profession can do in terms of cultural competency and in terms of empowering patients to take care of themselves, and so in terms of race. Movement is Life is a health disparity, our organization's been studying health disparities across the country, multidisciplinary. And if you go to their website, Movement is Life, Start Moving, Start Living, there are abundance of references in terms of specific strategies and programs. And I just say one of them is called Operation Change, where they're training women, Latina and African-American women in different cities as to how to better take care of them in terms of diet, in terms of other kinds of health activities. Because we all know that most of the impact on health is not the encounter within the healthcare system, but the socioeconomic factors that impact on health.
Thank you, Professor McClellan. We have time for one more question because we have to leave a few minutes for folks who are requesting CLE credits to complete the survey and to make sure they get that back to us. So Kyle, do we have one more question that we can take?
Sure. Someone mentioned the importance of health literacy during the patient-provider interactions. Does someone have anything they would like to add to that statement? Dr. Cruz, perhaps?
Sure. Health literacy, for those who are unfamiliar with that concept, it's the understanding, it's the idea that you can be smart in other areas, but health is a unique field, and it's sometimes you can be a PhD person, you can be a lawyer who's written all sorts of great books on Amazon, but you may not understand healthcare. And so that explains some of the disparities in race that we see, is that there's differences in health literacy, the understanding of health numbers and health facts. What we try to do at Fight Pediatrics and at Philadelphia Fight in general is we take the stance that it is my obligation to make sure that you understand what's going on. And one way to do that is a quick tool called it's called the teach back method, where I teach you something and then I say, hey, Kyle, just to make sure I did a good job teaching you about your asthma, can you help me understand what you know, what the plan is? And then you repeat the plan back to me. If you repeat it perfectly, that's great. If you repeat it incorrectly 10% of the time, my job is to correct that 10% so that you leave the office knowing exactly what I think you think.
I would also encourage folks to go to critpath.org, which is the website for the Critical Path Learning Center, an initiative of Philadelphia Fight, which focuses on health literacy and digital literacy as well. I could go on and on and on. Come on, Kyle, give me one more question.
Sure. So we have a statement and we have a question. Can you see those, Dion?
I can. Is it from Mr. Hill?
Yep. We have one.
Okay.
And
Mr. Hill and Mr. Ragsdale. I'm going to go with Professor McClellan. Comment on this very quickly, please. Mr. Ragsdale asks, can you relate your client's tragic story to the original slave history of the GYN discipline and how it still has an effect on human dignity and human valuation today? How important is knowing the history? I'll start by saying that Professor McClellan makes clear that knowing the history and the historical context behind all these issues is so important. If you get the book, and when you get the book, you'll see that he weaves a personal narrative together with history, together with his experiences in malpractice and as a practicing attorney to kind of come to these ultimate conclusions. So, of course, if you were to look at a historical context and historical construct of Black femininity, womanhood, Black women's ability to have agency over themselves, over their bodies, nightmare stories of hysterectomies, of instances of, research that hadn't been adequately vetted and using people of color, women of color as guinea pigs in that way. Of course, I think that was a very nice way to connect the dots. So Professor McClellan's answer, I'm sure, would be yes, that there's a very strong historical context to that issue. And he may be able to throw out a title of a book that you can pick out and that you can maybe get more background on. In fact, what I'll do is we'll look at the list and we'll add a book to the list and we'll make sure that that is included together with the other resources on the website. So to close out, I'll say that we do have these resources on the website. My PowerPoint presentation, Professor McClellan put together a much more substantive presentation that has case law and is much more detailed than mine was. We also have the bios of the presenters and a way for you to purchase Frank McClellan's book, Healthcare and Human Dignity. I mean, it is really a great read. It's something that all of us can take something from. My contact information is available online at Philadelphia Fight. It is D Powell, DPOWELL @fight.org. Dr. Cruz, I'm sure, would give his email address as mcruz@fight.org for any follow-up questions. And Professor McClellan's email address is frank@temple.edu. Again, wanted to thank the presenters, thank Frank, thank Mario, thanks to Kyle, thanks to Ralph Simon, who helped put together the presentation, and to everybody who came out today. It was really a pleasure to see 100 folks still in attendance when I'm trying to get us out of here. So thanks a lot. We really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you, Dion. Thank you, Professor McClellan. Thank you, Dr. Cruz, for being here today. I just want to reiterate that there is a survey after this webinar. Just let us know how we're doing, how the presentation was. And I want to reiterate that resources will be provided, and just look out for those. So thank you so much, everyone. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and have a great day.
Woo! Had a great time.
Thank you.